Hey guys, it is finally that time of the season where we'll be doing our jury scenarios for Survivor 47. Now, I'm actually doing this a bit earlier than what I normally do, as on all the other seasons that I've covered on this channel, I ended up doing this video right before the finale, which is around the final five. However, this season decided to shake things up by having a two-part finale, which starts at the final six. We'll have a double elimination there, and then the proper finale will be at the final four, which kind of puts me in a weird spot, as if I waited until the proper finale to do this, then there would only be one round of gameplay left, that being the fire making challenge, and there would only be 6 final 3 scenarios to talk about, which is obviously not as much fun. So instead, I decided to do it now at the final 6, which greatly increases the amount of final 3 scenarios, but we'll get to that soon enough. Now, at the time recording, there are 6 people left in the game, that being Andy, Genevieve, Rachel, Sam, Sue, and Teeny. And I think just looking at this final 6, I think the two biggest jury threats are Rachel and Genevieve here. Where I feel like based off what we've seen on the show and what we've heard from the jury in the exit interviews, I feel like Rachel and Genevieve are being perceived as these big threats and these smart players who will probably garner a lot of respect if they get to the end. Though obviously the main challenge will be getting there, and that's where my edgic analysis comes into play a bit more, where I said before that I don't think Genevieve is getting to the end, so admittedly that kind of makes a lot of the scenarios that have her less likely to happen, while the scenarios that have Rachel in them are more likely to happen, as I feel like Rachel is the frontrunner to win based off the edit. So I feel like because of that, Rachel is definitely someone I'm looking at a lot of to actually win. However, the main question will be how they'll do head to head, and we'll talk about that soon enough. Next up we have Sam, and Sam is someone I have a lot more difficulty with determining his win equity, where I feel like I haven't gotten that much information from the exit interviews about how a lot of the jury perceives Sam at this current point, where I feel like aside from Sierra, I don't think a lot of the jury is that high on Sam at the end of the day, and would probably vote for Rachel or Genevieve over him, which is kind of funny considering he is like this underdog and someone that you would expect would be able to come up with a story by the end of it. But we also saw Xander from 41 be in a similar spot, and even after gaining some agency at the tail end of the game, was still unable to garner respect. So I think Sam definitely has an uphill battle if he wants to actually win the game at the end. And I think there's definitely things that could change in these last couple rounds that could change his perception, but I feel like for the time being, I'm not looking at Sam as the biggest jury threat in the world. Next up, we have Teeny, and I feel like I have a bit more of a read on Teeny at this point, which admittedly is not that great, where I think on one hand, they definitely have some supporters. I think people like Sierra and Saul were pretty close to them on the island and would probably be sympathetic towards them if they got to the end. But we also have people like Gabe, who talked pretty negatively about Teeny in his exit interview, talking about how they were really tunnel vision of voting out Genevieve, and their relationship at the tail end of his run wasn't that great. So I feel like there are definitely people who are not that crazy about Teeny, and considering their game as a whole has been pretty mediocre, I can't really imagine Teeny doing well in too many scenarios, where I feel like in a lot of cases, the votes they'll be getting will be from people that they've built good social relationships with. And I feel like that'll be their case to win if they get towards the end, by leaning into these relationships they built with the likes of Saul and Sierra. And while that could garner them votes in certain scenarios, I don't think it'll be enough for them to be a favorite in a lot of scenarios. Next up, we have Andy, and Andy's another person that is kind of difficult to read, where on one hand, there's a lot of evidence that Andy is a GOAT, where we've literally heard people talk on the show about how Andy can't win a jury vote at the end, and that he's taking up a spot at Final Tribal, which is definitely something I subscribe to. I feel like Andy has this perception of being this pretty messy player and the George Costanza, and someone that people see as this annoying little brother. And I think that's a perception that's really difficult to shake even after you make big moves in the game. But on the other hand, we just saw Andy be part of this massive blindside to take out Caroline, and we saw the jury talking about how this is Andy's move, how Andy flipped, which obviously could point to the perception starting to shift. However, it's just hard to gauge so far out from the end of the game whether people will actually start to take Andy seriously, or if they'll just find a way to give the credit to other people, like Genevieve, for instance. So I'm kind of on the fence over whether Andy is actually changing his perception or not, and I think for the purposes of this video, I'm doing it under the assumption that Andy will be unable to change this perception, which again, you can definitely disagree with, and obviously we'll have to see how the rest of the game plays out. But I think for this video, I think Andy's definitely someone who has a lot of challenges for winning a jury vote, but again, it's not impossible for him to win. And finally, we have Sue, who I'm pretty convinced is a GOAT at this point. I just can't see how she wins a jury vote at the end, considering her edit and considering the game that she's played, where she has played a very baseline game of just sticking by Gabe and Caroline the whole time, to the point where she was the only person to not vote out Gabe during the round where he went home, which is a pretty bad look. But even beyond that, she has this perception of being an emotional player where she's had this grudge against Kyle the entire season. You had the way that she conducted herself during the TK round, which has been looked at pretty negatively. And I feel like there's almost no merit to Sue actually winning a jury vote. However, I do think it's very likely that she'll actually get to the end, which makes all the scenarios that have her in it more likely to happen. So she at least has that going for her, but I'm not looking at Sue as that serious of a contender at all. And then moving over to the jury, we currently have 5 people on the jury, that being Sierra, Saul, Gabe, Kyle, and Caroline. And as I alluded to a moment ago, I feel like this jury is largely favorable towards Rachel and Genevieve here, largely due to them being perceived as the biggest threats and being these smart players. But I think for Rachel in particular, there's more evidence of the jury being on her side, where the likes of Sierra, Saul, Kyle, Caroline have all talked very favorably about Rachel in their exit interviews, talking about how they had like this very close relationship to her. And I feel like that will definitely pay dividends for the scenarios where Rachel gets to the end. Though I think there's opportunities for other players to get certain votes in certain scenarios here, where Teenie has a pretty good relationship with Sierra and Saul based off their exit interviews. And there's definitely a world where Sierra and Saul are open to voting for Teenie, not necessarily because they played the best game in the world, but due to them like having this connection and them being sympathetic towards Teenie. So I think that's a possibility there. I think even a Caroline is not out of the question for Teenie in certain scenarios. I think there's also a lot of scenarios where Sam and Sue get sympathy votes from the likes of Sierra and Caroline respectively. So I think that's definitely something to look out for. And I think the biggest question mark is how Andy's perception will change in the last few rounds, where, as I said earlier, for a lot of the season, it seemed like Andy was going to lose jury vote, and he simply did not have the respect from the jury, even though he seemed to want to play this big game. But we did get some hints at the end of the last episode that the jury is starting to recognize Andy a bit more, and the question is whether it will translate to Andy getting a lot of votes. Now, if I had to guess, I don't think it will in a lot of cases, and I'm making this video under the assumption that this one move will not be enough to get Andy to win, especially over the likes of Rachel or Genevieve. But I do think it's something to look out for, and if my forecast ends up being wrong, I think that'll definitely be a key reason why. But again, it's just something to look out for. So that's the overview of the players still in the game as well as the jury. In this video, I'm going to be ranking all the possible final 3 scenarios based on how likely I think they are to happen and to forecast what I think would happen if those scenarios were to happen. And even though we're just adding one more player into the mix, that actually doubles the amount of scenarios that can happen here. So in this video, we'll be ranking 20 possible final 3 scenarios that could happen on the season. And let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 20, the final 3 scenario that I believe is the least likely to happen from this point on is ironically one that got a lot of focus on in the last episode, but we do have Andy versus Genevieve versus Sam. And it's kind of funny that I have these 3 at the very bottom considering they were just involved in this pretty massive blindside, that being Operation Italy. And they are shown to be working together at this point, but I think that from a pure game standpoint, this final 3 has pretty much a 0% chance of happening at this point, where for one, it has Genevieve in it, where I said before that I feel like Genevieve is the least likely person to actually get to the end, which in turn pulls down all the scenarios that have her in it, so I think that's a pretty big knock. But I think even beyond that, from a pure game standpoint, while they just pulled off this massive blindside, they are still only at a 3-3 tie, which is not enough, especially with the other side having a block a vote. And with Rachel only having 1 round left to use that block a vote, it's just very unlikely that they're going to be able to get the numbers in a scenario unless they pull Rachel to her side. And even though Andy and Rachel have this established relationship from the show, we also know that Rachel wants Genevieve out. And I feel like this will be the perfect opportunity for Rachel to take Genevieve out of the game and really bolster her own resume. So I feel like through that, it just doesn't make a lot of sense for Rachel to actually flip to their side in this round, especially when Genevieve is on the table, and especially when she has this pretty potent advantage that she could use to make this big move. And I don't think she'll waste this move just to take out the likes of Teenie or Sue in this case. So I think more than likely this final 3 will get broken up in this next round, which in turn will make this scenario pretty unlikely to happen. But if this scenario were to somehow happen, I think Genevieve would win pretty handily here, or the only vote that could possibly go another way is Sierra, who I could see putting a sympathy vote onto Sam, but I think all the other votes would be pretty clearly on Genevieve in this scenario here. And while it's possible for Annie to make some inroads here by taking credit for the Operation Italy move, I think the fact that all three of the people involved in the move are here just makes it more difficult for Andy to claim sole credit for it. And I think that only benefits Genevieve in that scenario. So at the end of the day, I think Genevieve is the clear favorite here. But again, I don't think the scenario is happening anyway. So it's because of that that's here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19. And as I alluded to in the last segment, a lot of these scenarios coming up are going to have Genevieve in it, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 19, we do have Genevieve versus Sam versus Teeny. And the reason this one is so low is because it has Sam and Teeny in it, who have this established rivalry at this point, where Teeny has made it very apparent that they want Sam out, which I think just makes it less likely that this scenario happens to begin with. And where the only way that I can see it happening is if Sam wins out from this point, but even then, they'll probably take out Genevieve instead. So I just find it very unlikely that this scenario happens anyway. But if it were to happen, I think Genevieve would once again be the favorite here. Now, I think Teeny has more opportunities to get votes here, where, again, the likes of Sierra, Saul, even Caroline will be pretty open to voting for them. I think even Sue is not out of the question, considering that Sue and Caroline are pretty close. So I think there's definitely opportunities for Teeny to get some votes and possibly Sam snagging that Sierra vote. But at the end of the day, I feel like it will not be enough to overcome Genevieve's advantage here. But again, I don't think the scenario is happening either, which is why it's here, number 19. Now, moving on to number 18, we have another scenario that doesn't really make sense from an Edgic perspective, but we do have Genevieve versus Rachel versus Sam. Now, I think the scenario has the same issue as the last one, where it has both Genevieve and Sam within it, where I feel like it's very unlikely that they'll both get to the end together, considering they're both on the outs and are pretty likely to be on the outs at this point. But I also think from an Edger perspective, it also doesn't make a lot of sense, considering that Rachel has talked for multiple episodes about wanting Genevieve out, and it would just be kind of weird for her to allow Genevieve to get to the end in a spot to where she could have allowed that to happen instead. Now, I think from a game standpoint, there is a path for this to happen where maybe at some point Genevieve and Sam like throw Andy to the wolves and really allow him to take the fall for a lot of their actions. So I think there's definitely a path there, but I just don't think it's particularly likely. Now, if this scenario were to happen, I'm actually not entirely sure how accurate this really is, but I actually have Rachel as a favorite in this scenario here, where admittedly a lot of that is due to me just not having more information about how Genevieve stacks up against Rachel specifically, where I feel like we just have more information about Rachel and how a lot of the jury seems to have good relationships with Rachel. So I actually think through that, Rachel probably beats Genevieve in a head-to-head matchup here, and actually by a decent amount as well, where even the likes of Andy would probably see Rachel as being like this person that he couldn't be at the end, and they obviously had this like thing that's been going on the entire season. So I think there's that. And I think in general, like with a lot of people just having better personal connections to Rachel, I think that'll definitely benefit Rachel in that specific scenario here. Now, again, there's definitely opportunities for Genevieve and Sam to get votes, particularly Gabe, who I think will be up for grabs here, as I could definitely see him favoring Genevieve due to her being part of this big move that happened the final 7. And obviously, Sierra is another up for grabs vote here. But I do think Rachel probably gets the other votes. If I'm being honest, though, I'm not entirely clear on that. But again, I don't think this scenario is happening either, which is why it's here number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we actually have the highest ranked scenario that has both Genevieve and Sam within it, but we do have Genevieve versus Sam versus Sue. And to me, I think there's only one clear path for this to happen, and that is for Andy to somehow flip Rachel at the final 6, take out Teeny there. Final 5, like they betray Andy or something, and then final 4, like they beat Rachel in fire making. I think that's probably the clearest path here. And I think considering that Sue is his pretty clear GOAT, I could definitely see the likes of Genevieve and Sam wanting to have that person there to ensure like a more fair matchup here. And I think if this scenario were to happen, I think Genevieve would again be the favorite here, where I think Sierra and Caroline would get sympathy votes to Sam and Sue respectively. But beyond that, I think Genevieve gets every other vote pretty handily, if I'm being honest. But again, I just don't think Genevieve and Sam are getting to the end together. I think they're definitely going to be broken up before the end, which definitely makes the scenario less likely to happen than all the others. So because of that, it is still here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we're continuing on this train of scenarios that have Genevieve in it. And here we have Andy versus Genevieve versus Teeny. And again, I think this one's a bit more likely to happen, as it at least doesn't have Genevieve and Sam in there. However, it still has Andy and Genevieve in there, which I think is still pretty unlikely. I think definitely one of them are going to be broken up at some point before the end. And I think if this scenario were to happen, I do think Genevieve would be a clear favorite here. Now, I do think Teeny could get some more votes here in the likes of Sierra and Sue. I think Caroline and Saul could also be some swing votes here. So I do think Teeny actually has more of a shot, and there is some potential for this being a competitive final three. However, I think it is still pretty unlikely to happen from this point on, which is why it is here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have a similar scenario, but just swapping out one person, but we do have Andy versus Genevieve versus Rachel. And again, I think this one's also pretty unlikely considering that Rachel has been getting all the setup to take out Genevieve down the road. But if we're not taking Rachel's win as a sure thing, then I think there is a world where Andy could pull together the likes of Genevieve and Rachel to bring them together, considering that he has established relationships with both of them on the show. And there's, again, some possibility of them becoming this new Final 3, though, again, I don't think it's particularly likely. And I think if it were to happen, I think Rachel would once again win pretty handily here, where Genevieve would probably get some potential votes here in the likes of Sam and Sierra. Again, who knows where Gabe goes here. But really, at the end of the day, I think not much changes. I still think Rachel's a clear favorite here. But again, I don't think the scenario is happening either, which is why it's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have another scenario that has Genevieve and Rachel in it, but we have Genevieve versus Rachel versus Teeny. Now again, I think this one's a little more likely to happen, considering that they could probably see Teeny as like this person that they could take to the end, and Andy could be someone that Genevieve could throw under the bus. So I think through that, there's definitely a world where Genevieve could sneak her way to the end because of that, where Genevieve could win immunity at final 6. Rachel plays a riddle there. They take out Andy at 5 or something like that. And then at that point, they just get their way to the end because of that. So again, not likely, but there's technically a path. And if it were to happen, I still think Rachel would win just based off the votes there. Again, not really much changes here where while there could be a couple swing votes here and there, I think at the end of the day, Rachel has more than enough votes to secure the win. But I still don't think this one's particularly likely, which is why it's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have the highest ranked scenario that has Genevieve and Rachel in it, but we do have Genevieve versus Rachel versus Sue. And I think this is probably the most straightforward path if they were both to get to the end, where Genevieve were to win out and Rachel were still able to get to the end because of that, where I feel like Sue would probably be the most likely person that they would drag there as the easiest GOAT. And I think if this were to happen, not much changes. I don't think Sue really gets any votes outside of Caroline. And I don't think any of the possible swing votes change either, where I think Sam and Sierra could be swing votes. I think Gabe could be a swing vote. But I think every other vote should be pretty locked in for Rachel here. Should be a relatively smooth ride for her to win, even with some of these votes potentially going to Genevieve. But again, I don't think Genevieve and Rachel are going to get to the end together, which is why I still have the scenario here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we are now getting to the scenarios that Genevieve could realistically attain. However, I just don't think they're very likely because I just don't think Genevieve's likely to get to the end in general. But at number 12, we do have Andy versus Genevieve versus Sue. And again, I think the main reason this one is so low is because I just don't think Andy and Genevieve are getting to the end together, where I think more than likely what happens here is that Sam goes home at 6, and unless Andy's able to pull in Rachel at 5, I do think one of them are probably getting broken up at that point. But who knows? Something could happen here. They could pull in Rachel here, and then Rachel just loses fire making at 4. I mean, that's a possibility. But otherwise, I just don't think the scenario is as likely to happen. Now, I think if this scenario were to happen, I think this is definitely one of Genevieve's more solid wins here, where I think she wins near unanimously in this scenario, only losing Caroline's vote, who I think would be a sympathy vote there for Sue. But I think every other vote should be pretty locked in for Genevieve here. And again, this is assuming that Andy doesn't become more of a threat down the line. But again, I don't think the scenario is happening, which is why it's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the highest ranked scenario that has Genevieve in it, but we do have Genevieve versus Sue versus Teeny. Now, realistically, I think there's definitely some qualms we have with the scenario, as Teeny has talked about wanting Genevieve out as well. Mind you, not as strongly as Rachel, and certainly not as much as Teeny has wanted Sam out recently, but whatever. But I do think this is probably Genevieve's best case scenario in terms of actually getting to the end, where if she's able to like navigate like this situation, like maybe she wins Final 6 immunity, survives that, is it then able to like cause a flip to happen at Final 5? I think there's a world where she could take out Rachel at 5 and Andy at 4 to get this Final 3 here. And I think if it were to happen, I still think Genevieve would clearly win. Now, I think Teeny will probably get Sierra's vote, if I'm being honest. And beyond that, I think Caroline would clearly vote for Sue in this scenario. And who knows where Saul goes. But I do think all the other votes should be pretty locked up for Genevieve here. Not too much to say here. But at the end of the day, I just don't think Genevieve's getting to the end, which is why all these scenarios are towards the bottom half of the list, and why this scenario is still only here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and from this point on, every single scenario left does not have Genevieve in it, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 10, we still have a scenario that I'm not feeling that great about, and here we have Andy versus Sam versus Teeny. And again, this one is not as likely for other reasons that I mentioned earlier, like the fact that Sam and Teeny had this rivalry, the fact that it's both Andy and Sam in there, where while again, Andy could work himself well enough with Rachel to ensure that Rachel keeps him around, I just don't think it's likely that Andy gets there with Sam specifically. So I think this one still has a lot that has to happen for it to actually take place here. Now, I actually think this could be an interesting scenario for were to happen, as I think all three of them have opportunities to get votes here, where right off the bat, I think Teeny would have 3 locked votes in Saul, Caroline, and Sue there. I think Sam gets Sierra's vote. I think that's pretty clear. I think Andy would probably get Genevieve's vote in this scenario, as if this is a scenario where Andy takes out Genevieve, then I could see a world where Genevieve respects Andy's game more, and over the likes of Sam and Teeny, that would be enough to have her vote for Andy. So I think right off the bat, all three of them have votes, and really the remaining votes are probably up for grabs between Andy and Sam, if I'm being honest, where I could see Gabe, Kyle, and Rachel really going either way between them, where I think if all of them put their votes onto one person, then either Andy or Sam could take the win outright over Teeny, though I still think there's a world where Teeny could pull up plurality win. But obviously this is all under the assumption that Teeny gets Caroline and Sue to begin with, which admittedly is not a guarantee if I'm being honest, but again, I do think this is actually one of the more interesting scenarios, specifically because I think these are all people who are not the biggest jury threats in the world, so obviously someone has to win. But I still think this scenario is probably not as likely to happen for the reasons I mentioned earlier, which is why it's only here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another pretty interesting scenario, all things considered, and here we have Sam versus Sue versus Teeny. Now, as I said earlier, I don't think Sam and Teeny are likely to get to the end together. However, I think if Sam were to win out, there is more of a chance that Teeny could slip her way to the end alongside Sam, where I think probably what happens is that Genevieve and Andy go out at some point before the end. And I think in Final Four, if Sam and Teeny are there together, they would at least recognize that they have to take out Rachel at that point, to where, like, that probably happens, Rachel loses fire making, and we get this scenario. So even though I don't think edgically it makes a ton of sense for Sam and Teeny to get to the end together, I think there is a path, particularly if Sam were to win out from this point on. And I think if this were to happen, Sam probably wins here, where I think at that point, this is probably one of the few scenarios where Sam outright wins, where even though Teeny and Sue will probably get some votes here from Saul and Caroline, I think every other vote would probably go to Sam in this situation, especially considering the context of Sam winning out to get to this scenario to begin with. I think that could definitely garner Sam a decent amount of respect because of that. And with him having taken out like the likes of Rachel on the way, I think Sam would probably be the most likely to inherit the credit for that move. So I think through that, Sam probably wins at this scenario. Probably one of the few scenarios that Sam outright wins, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's as likely to happen, which is why it's here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have a similar scenario, but just swapping out one person, but we do have Andy versus Sam versus Sue. And again, I think this is another pretty similar scenario here where maybe like Genevieve gets cut at 6, and at that point, Andy and Rachel are able to team up to potentially take out Teeny at 5, maybe taking advantage of that rivalry between Sam and Teeny there. And while I think the fact that Rachel isn't there lowers the likelihood of the scenario happening, I still think it is at least more likely than scenarios that have Genevieve in there. And I think if this scenario were to happen, I think it would probably be a battle between Sam and Andy here, where the only vote Sue will probably get is Caroline, and even then that'll probably be a sympathy vote. But really, it's a battle between Andy and Sam, where I think Sam would get the lock vote of Sierra, Andy would get the votes of Genevieve and Teeny, and really comes down to those Gabe, Kyle, and Rachel votes, where it really comes down to how much this jury respects Andy and how much they see Andy as the big player at the end of the day, where admittedly I think Rachel probably leans towards Sam, though I think if Andy is able to take Rachel out along the way, that Rachel could respect Andy more. And realistically, I think this is probably Andy's best case scenario winning the season here, where I think if he's able to like come off as a big player during his last couple of rounds, be able to have a hand in taking out Genevieve and Rachel along the way, that he could probably get some credit and potentially win this season because of that. Though at the same time, I still think this scenario is probably not as likely to happen, as I probably think Andy probably would not win. And even then, even if this scenario were to happen, would Andy get that much credit at the end of the day? I'm not entirely sure, but at the end of the day, I still think the scenario is only good enough to be here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another scenario where we're just swapping out one person, but we do have Andy versus Sue versus Teeny. And again, the main differentiator is the fact that Sue is in there instead of Sam, where I feel like Sue is more likely to be dragged to the end at this point. And it's also one where Teeny gets to cut Sam along the way, so I think all that's pretty good. And I think if the scenario were to happen, I think Andy might actually win this scenario, believe it or not, where I think Teeny probably gets some votes from Sierra and Saul, but I think Andy would have probably more locked votes in this scenario, where I think he gets Genevieve's vote. I'm pretty sure he gets Rachel's vote in this scenario as well. I think Gabe and Kyle probably lean towards Andy, as they never seen that high on Teeny in particular. And who knows where Sam goes in this scenario. I mean, I could see Sam going either way. And with Caroline voting for Sue, I think that's enough to give Andy the win here. So again, I think this is another pretty interesting scenario, but not as likely to happen as their other ones, which is why it's only here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and from this point on, all the other scenarios left have Rachel in them, which I guess is a bit of a spoiler for how those will turn out, but we'll get to that soon enough. But number 6, the least likely of those scenarios to happen is Rachel versus Sam versus Teeny. And again, this one is probably the least likely because I just don't think Teeny would want to take Sam to the end. And I feel like Teeny will probably vote out Sam before considering dragging him along. So I think that makes the scenario a bit less likely to happen as a result. Not to mention that Sue is not there, who is this easy go and is pretty clearly being set up to be dragged to the end anyway. But I think the scenario were to happen, I think Rachel clearly wins, where I think Sam and Teeny could get some sympathy votes from the likes of Sierra and Saul. But beyond that, I think this is a pretty decisive Rachel win at the end of the day. But again, I feel like there are other scenarios that are more likely to happen than this one, which is why it's only here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have yet another somewhat interesting scenario to get into here, and that is Andy versus Rachel versus Sam. And again, I don't think this one is not the most likely to happen, as I feel like Andy and Sam are probably not going to get towards the end. I feel like Genevie probably goes at 6, and then one of them is probably gone at 5. And even then, like, who knows, like, what will happen at the final for fire making. So I'm not entirely convinced that Andy and Sam will get to the end together, but I think if the scenario were to happen, it would be a pretty clear Rachel win here, where the only possible vote that Sam could get is from Sierra. I don't think Andy gets any votes in this scenario, which is pretty unfortunate. And again, it's just a Rachel steamroll, but I don't think this scenario is the most likely to happen simply because I feel like it's unlikely that both Andy and Sam will get to the end together, and especially over the likes of Sue, who I can't really see being voted out before the end, and also can't see losing the fire making challenge. So I feel like it's for that reason that I have this scenario here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have a pretty similar scenario, and that is Andy versus Rachel versus Teeny. And again, the main deciding factor is the fact that Sue is not there. I feel like Sue is clearly getting a runners up at it. And through that, it would just not make that much sense to cut Sue before the end. And even if Sue were to get the final 4, I think she probably wins the fire making challenge anyway. So again, the fact that Sue is not there makes this scenario less likely to happen. Which is funny, as I think if the scenario were to happen, I think Rachel wins unanimously. As in this scenario, you don't have Sue there to get a sympathy vote from Caroline. You also don't have Sam there to get a sympathy vote from Sierra. I think it would just be a clean sweep across the board, which is funny that I don't have that as the most likely scenario, even though I'm pretty confident that Rachel is winning. But again, for those reasons, considering the edit that Sue has gotten, I just can't really see Sue being cut before the end, which is why I still have this scenario here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have another pretty interesting scenario to get into here, and that is Andy versus Rachel versus Sue. And this is actually the highest ranked scenario that has Andy in it, as admittedly, as I talked about in my power rankings, I don't think Andy's getting to the end. I feel like with the edit that he's been getting, that being this like mastermind for lack of a better word, I think Andy's being set to be like this final boss of the season, someone that Rachel eventually takes out to become the winner of the season. Though considering that we have seen their relationship be established on the show and being this up and down thing, I think this is probably the one final tribal scenario that has Andy in it that would make a little bit of sense, where he's there with Rachel and it's clearly framed to be like this showdown between Andy and Rachel. However, this scenario were to happen, I think the showdown would be pretty underwhelming, as Rachel would win near unanimously, getting every single vote outside of possibly Caroline's, and even Caroline will probably vote for Sue here. So I feel like considering that context, it probably does make it more likely that Andy simply just doesn't get to the end to begin with, as it would simply be funny to have Andy getting this mastermind edit only for him to get pretty much no votes at Final Tribal. But still, this scenario is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like these last two scenarios are ones that I could realistically see happening, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, the one that I think is a little less likely to happen, is Rachel versus Sue versus Teenie. And the reason I had this one here at number 2 instead of number 1 is that I don't really think Teenie is set up to be a losing finalist. I think they're probably more likely to lose in the fire making challenge at Final 4. And admittedly, some of that is game based, where I think realistically the most likely Final 4 is Rachel, Sue, Teenie, and Sam. And I would imagine Teenie is the worst fire maker between those 4, meaning Teenie probably loses that situation. But even beyond that, from an edit standpoint, I think there's also plenty of standing for Teenie to be a losing finalist here, where I feel like their edit in the post-merge has been really strange, where they've had this storyline about wanting to find a home and find their community, only for them to be on the outs for so much of the post-merge. You also have them getting their personal content after failing to get Genevieve out, and they end up holding up their burnt bag and saying how this represents their new life in the game, and I feel like a lot of this imagery is just pointing to them like coming up just short before the end. In some ways, it reminds me of Katura from 45. So I think in a lot of ways, like if I had to pick one person to lose the fire making challenge at this point, it's probably Teenie, if I'm being honest, both from a gain standpoint, but I feel like edit wise as well, it's just giving me vibes that Teenie's probably going to come up short by the end of it. But if this scenario were to happen, it would just be a blow anyway. Rachel would win pretty handily. Only vote possibly going to Sue is Caroline, but really that's not enough. So really, I think this one would just end with a clear Rachel win, but it's that minor difference in Teenie being there that leaves this scenario behind at number 2. And now at number 1, the final 3 scenario that I believe is the most likely to happen is Rachel versus Sam versus Sue. And again, I think this one probably makes the most sense at this point, considering that I have so many other issues with the other 3 people, where I think Genevieve is clearly being said to be taken out as this big threat. You have Andy, who I think is meant to be this final boss, and again, probably not having enough win equity to have that showdown be on Final Tribal. And then you have Teenie, who I think is probably losing in fire making. So I feel like that leaves these other 3 as the most likely, where Rachel is the clear winner, Sue is the clear GOAT, and then you have Sam, whose edit would not be entirely out of line with that of a runners-up edit, where even though we haven't really seen as many of his mistakes in the post-merge compared to certain other runners-up in the new era, I think there's definitely some merit to it, where he had a strong start, but then his game kind of crumbled in the post-merge, and in this most recent episode, we got plenty of negativity from Teenie specifically. So I think Sam being a runner-up is not that out of line from an Edgic's perspective, and I think from a gain standpoint, there is some merit to it as well, where I think Sam just wins out from this point. I think Sam definitely has potential to win out, survive over Genevieve and Andy, and that's how we get to this final 3. And this final 3 were to happen, Rachel just wins. Where, again, Sam could get Sierra's vote, Sue could get Caroline's vote, but that's pretty much it. I think Rachel gets every other vote, so, again, it is a bit of an underwhelming conclusion, but I do think considering the edits that all 3 of these people have gotten, mixing in the lack of potential to get to the end the other 3 had demonstrated, I think this is the most logical final 3 at this point based off the information that I have, and it's for that reason that it's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. Now, after the season ends, I plan to do a player ranking and review of the season, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.